Okay, welcome back everyone to Grockit's OGTV. This is Jim Jacobson. I'm doing the GMAT edition of Grockit's OGTV. We also have an SAT edition going right now, so if that's what you came for, I'm sorry. I'm not going to do that. Like I said, though, this is the GMAT edition, like it says on the screen too. For some reason, I just really like drawing these arrows, I guess because it's something I don't normally get to do in the course of the broadcast. We're using the 12th edition to the official guide to the test, the one with the purple cover and the kind of yellow writing. Is that right? Did I make that up? Yeah, no, that's right. Just had to look at my book. And we're going from one end to the other. Right now, we're on page 378 with the reading comprehension section. And, we've made a little bit of a switch in the format to make sure that we finish all the questions on a passage. So we're going a little bit slower, just a little bit slower than perhaps we ought, not ought to, but perhaps we could, or I could really, since I'm the one who's doing it. But I wanted to make sure that in each broadcast we get to good stopping points and you don't have to carry thoughts over from a passage from one day to the next. So that's what's going on, and that's why the pace has changed a little bit from what you might have seen scheduled originally. I guess I don't really have anything else to say about it. Oh, I guess I should give that background information in case this is your first time tuning in. What I do is, with the reading comprehension anyway, is I give you enough time to read it to yourself. I don't read the whole passage out loud. That might be kind of fun, but I think I'd lose my voice eventually, and it also doesn't really simulate what it would be like on the test day for you. You are going to be reading these things to yourself. I will be taking notes on the passage. You are not obligated to do so. My notes will be a little bit more thorough and easier to understand than perhaps they might be if I were the only one reading them. But not much. I mean, I do still try to keep them kind of abbreviated. So I do the notes over here. And again, note-taking on the reading comprehension. If you're watching this and reading comprehension is something that you struggle with, consider trying brief note-taking. Not so much that you're going to be referring to those notes later, but the act of note-taking both prevents you from going too far without spacing out. It gives you this other thing to concentrate on other than just staring at the screen. And also, numerous psychological studies have shown that the act of taking notes itself helps fix things more firmly in your mind. They've done studies with students in classes, and the students who took notes, even if they didn't have their notes to refer to, did better on tests. So it's not a bad habit to get into or to try if you are at all looking to improve on your reading comprehension. If you are just fine without it, there are people who get great scores without note-taking. So, this is one of those things where your mileage may vary. Anyway, let's get started. So like I said, I give you some time to read it to yourself. In critical reasoning and sentence correction and the math questions, I read the questions out loud. Reading comprehension, I read the questions but not the passages. Good story. You want to hear it again? No, I'm not going to tell you again. Well, I will tell you again on the next broadcast, but maybe not in the same length. You get the idea. Anyway, so question number 47, and we'll go with 4 minutes to read. And it'll be about 4 minutes because this is a pretty short passage. 4 minutes on Florentine female textile workers. Okay, we may as well start now. It's a shorter passage, so I don't feel so bad about giving you a little bit less time. So, question number 47. So first off, of course, the passage overall, talking about this human capital theory as it applies to Florentine textile industries, female workers, and how it potentially explains why they made less money. And then the second paragraph goes on to explain why the human capital theory doesn't quite explain everything. The author is, and again, it's always good to have an idea whether the author is advocating a particular course of action or just explaining something. In this particular case, the author isn't saying that 17th century female textile workers need to do anything different. Their opportunity has essentially passed, nor is the author advocating that some other theory take the place of human capital theory, just saying that there are some exceptions or some things that it doesn't cover. So, okay, number 47. The passage suggests that combing and carding differ from weaving in that combing and carding were, and so if we remember, combing and carding were mentioned towards the end of the first paragraph. And so we go back to look that up, and even if we didn't remember exactly where it was, you can do a quick skim to look for that phrase. The right answer will be something that we can infer. This is a inference question. When it says the passage suggests, it will be something that is almost stated but not quite stated by the passage. So combing and carding. So human capital theory, this is line 14, human capital theory explains why there was a high concentration of women workers in certain low-skill jobs, such as weaving, but not in others, such as combing or carding, by positing that because of their primary responsibility in child-rearing, women took occupations that could be carried out in the home. So it's kind of a complex sentence, but the distilled version is that there were a lot more women in combing and carding than in weaving because women took occupations that could be carried out in the home, which suggests that that was the difference between combing and carding and combing or carding and then weaving. Let's look for an answer choice that says something like that, or that there's something else that we could infer from that bit. There could be something else. So choice A, low-skill jobs, that combing and carding were low-skill jobs performed primarily by women employees. It's tempting to say that because it says there's a high concentration of women workers in certain low-skilled jobs, such as weaving, but we don't know that it was done primarily by women, only that it was that there was a higher concentration, or a high concentration relative to weaving, in combing and carding. So they may have only been 25% of the workers, but if they were 1% of the workers everywhere else, it's not women doing the majority. So not A. B, combing and carding were low-skill jobs that were not performed in the home. I think I might have reversed it in my previous explanation. But anyway, one or the other of weaving and combing or carding is performed in the home. And that's what this one is saying. That combing and carding, yes, there's a high concentration of women workers in low-skill jobs such as weaving, but not in combing or carding, because weaving could be done at home. And so that's what's actually implied by the passage. We shall keep that one. Let's take a look to see if anything else sounds good. Choice C, low-skill were combing and carding low-skill jobs performed by both male and female employees. Well, again, that's probably true, but it's not true that it's... so the question is actually that combing and carding differed from weaving in a certain way. And there's nothing in the passage that suggests that combing and carding had both male and female employees, but weaving did not. It just says that there's a higher concentration in weaving of women. So in order for C to be true, one or the other of those two activities would need to be only one sex performing them. and that is not implied by the passage. This is a tricky question. D, that combing and carding were high-skill jobs performed outside the home. Well, it does suggest that they were performed outside the home, but it actually states directly that combing and carding were low-skill jobs. So actually we can eliminate D and E based on their first three words, or first two words, if you consider high skill to be one word. So because it says high concentration of women workers in certain low-skill jobs, but not in others, such as combing or carding. So all three are low-skill jobs, but two of the three mentioned cannot be done in the home. Anyway, that leaves us with answer choice B. So I did kind of skip answer choice E, but since it says high-skill jobs, we know it can't be right. So B's the one. And unlike other question types, I try to leave the notes up. So I erase, or actually draw over it with a white brush. In case you're wondering why suddenly parts of the text disappear, it's because I'm not actually erasing. Good story. I know you're interested in all sorts of behind-the-scenes details like that. Anyway, question number 48. Which of the following, if true, would most weaken the explanation provided by the human capital theory for women's concentration in certain occupations in 17th century Florence? Now, this part that we were just reading was actually that part, I think, of the passage, where we heard about how there's a high concentration of women in one thing, but not in others. And the thing we just read said that women were doing weaving because they could do it at home because they were busy with children, giving birth to them and raising them. So we would need something that weakens that idea that women took the jobs because they could do them at home because of their children. Okay, answer choice A. And again, we're trying to weaken the human capital theory. So would it weaken it to say that A, women were unlikely to work outside the home even in occupations whose hours were flexible enough to allow women to accommodate domestic tasks as well as paid labor? So this doesn't hit exactly the points that I had predicted that it would hit. You know, I mentioned, and the passage mentions, that women had to take care of the children at home, and that's the reason why they took work that could be done at home. However, answer choice A does still give them a way to take jobs outside of the home, and they aren't taking it, which would weaken the human capital theory. Human capital theory says the only reason they took jobs at home was because they had work to do at home, housework, and children work. Choice A says they wouldn't take jobs outside the home even when they could, which would weaken the human capital explanation. So we'll keep that one and keep reading. Would it weaken it to say parents were, this is choice B, parents were less likely to teach occupational skills to their daughters than they were to their sons? So this is tempting at first because the human capital theory does involve the acquisition of skilled skills, high skill abilities that then result in the individual being paid better. However, human capital theory does not mandate that it is the parents who teach these skills. In fact, many of them are things that people learn on the job in sort of an apprenticeship situation. So parents not passing on the skills is not necessarily going to weaken the human capital theory. C. Women's participation in the Florentine paid labor force grew steadily throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. Well, that might be true, but I think that's kind of neutral as far as the human capital theory goes. As long as there was room for them to grow in the paid labor force, there's nothing that says that weakens human capital. In fact, it might strengthen it if those women were learning difficult job-related skills. Okay. So D, the vast majority of female weavers in the Florentine wool industry had children. Well, number one, of course, this is perhaps overly specific. I guess wool would be the primary cloth used because I don't know that they had silk or used flax in 17th century Florence. However, that's aside from being outside knowledge, the rest of the passage, it doesn't actually even matter whether they had children. What matters is whether it was children that were keeping them home, if that makes sense. So, and if anything, if the vast majority of them had children, that actually strengthens the human capital explanation, because the human capital theory explanation is that because women had child feeding and keeping and cleaning responsibilities, that's why they never took jobs outside the home. Anyway, it's not D. E, few women worked as weavers in the Florentine silk industry. Oh, I guess they did have silk. Okay, well, you learn something new every day. Few women worked as weavers in the Florentine silk industry, which was devoted to making cloths that required a high degree of skill to produce. And again, this would weaken the human capital theory that says that, or excuse me, would strengthen the human capital theory that says that the fact that women had to stop working all the time to take care of children or give birth to children because they were pregnant, that they didn't have the chance to acquire those skills and apply them in an ongoing way. And so this would strengthen human capital theory rather than weaken it. So that leaves us with A, which says that women, if it were true that women could have taken jobs outside the home and didn't, that it wasn't because of children keeping them home, which is what human capital theory says. So choice A weakens it. Okay, last one. So only 3 questions on this passage, which is probably for the best. I think these are actually kind of tricky because actually all 3 of these are inference questions. That's the reason why this passage, if you thought it was tricky at all, maybe you didn't. Maybe you're thinking, what is this guy talking about? This is not hard at all. All 3 are inference questions, which are, of course, one of the more common question types, but they're typically, I will even go so far as to say, is almost always more challenging than detail questions, which are about what's actually stated in the passage, because we're looking for something that didn't actually appear. So page 379, question number 49. Okay. Oh, and I gave it away that the next one is an inference question. I just looked ahead and saw the opening phrase, which is another one of those signals of an inference question. The author of the passage would be most likely to describe the explanation provided by the human capital theory for the high concentration of women in certain occupations in the 17th century Florentine textile industry as. Wow. So let's just break this down. The opening part just tells us it's an inference question. The author would be most likely to agree or be most likely to describe. So it's not something the author does describe, but we still have to have enough evidence in the passage to say, yes, this is what the author would be very likely to do. So that's an inference. The next part is the explanation provided by the human capital theory for the high concentration of women. So actually this next question is about the same part that we've been talking about. Actually, all 3 questions are basically about the second half of paragraph 1. All 3 questions, because it's asking about human capital theory's explanation for the high concentration of women in certain occupations in the 17th century Florentine textile industry. Which is that high concentration bit is line 15 and following. Okay, so what would the author think about that? Well, and so actually, this one actually brings in what happens next, which is where the author in the second paragraph talks about some of the problems with human capital theory, because we're asking, what would the author say about the human capital theory? Starting paragraph 2, the author says, there were, however, differences in pay scales that cannot be explained by the human capital theory. So the author clearly doesn't agree wholeheartedly. Let's take a look at the answer choices. Sorry, I did a lot of talking before we got to the answer choices, but let's take a look at them anyway. So would the author consider the human capital theory well-founded though incomplete? Well, the author doesn't really say nice things about the human capital theory, but the author does say that there are some differences. So this is possible. Let's see what the other answer choices are. Had to get both eyes on my smiley face. Answer choice B, difficult to articulate. To articulate means to explain or to say. So the author doesn't seem to have any problem articulating it, so that's not it. C, plausible but poorly substantiated. It does appear that that it is plausible. The author, gives most of the passage to human capital theory. Poorly substantiated. Substantiated means supported, and typically by evidence. And while we don't really get evidence per se in the passage at all, there are a number of anecdotal bits of data or references to what are probably facts, and it's in both the human capital section and in the other section. So it's not poorly substantiated. D, seriously flawed. Well, the second paragraph is about flaws. Let's actually keep this one. I don't normally keep two, but we do need to consider both of these, I think. And then E, contrary to recent research. Recent research isn't mentioned. So we have narrowed it down to seriously flawed, which is D, or well-founded though incomplete. And so this is really a question of tone more than anything. Does the author say anything like is there anything to suggest that the author thinks that human capital theory is seriously flawed? Really, all we hear in terms of criticism of human capital theory is that first sentence of paragraph 2. There were, however, differences in pay scales that cannot be explained by the human capital theory. And then the rest of it is just an explanation of that example. That is the weakest criticism I've ever seen from someone who thinks something is seriously flawed. So we can eliminate D on the basis of tone. The author says, hey, it's missing something. It doesn't explain everything as well as we would want it to. But that's not enough to say that the author thinks it's seriously flawed. In fact, it's much better to say that the author, even though we don't have a lot of evidence for saying it's well-founded, it's not nearly as extreme as saying it's seriously flawed. And choice A does include that the author thinks it was incomplete, which is really all we have evidence for. Okay, so that's that one. On to the next page, and this is one with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 questions. So we may as well get started. So this will be page 380, starting with question number 50. And once again, about 4 minutes, and then we'll hit the questions. So get to it. Okay, I lost track a little bit of when I actually started the clock on the 4 minutes, but I think it's been 4 minutes, and it's a relatively short passage in any case. And we do have 7 questions to get through, so it's probably okay if I ended a little bit early. Okay, so one long paragraph, so it doesn't lend itself as well to kind of dividing it up into discrete bits the way that many passages do, but that's okay. There's pretty much 3 distinct parts. One is that the first part, we find out that the surge in temporary employment in the 80s may not have been due to an increase in workers with that preference, but to employers with that preference. We find out, that there were two reasons why employers might prefer or might have been able to move to a larger temporary employment pool. And then the passage ends with the author advocating a course of action, namely that temporary employment should be discouraged so that only people who want to have temporary employment actually get it. So in this case, it is, and this is, again, that course of action that I recommend is finishing each passage knowing whether the author has an opinion about something and is advocating a course of action. In this case, the author clearly has an agenda, and let's see, 1, 2. There's the word "should" appears twice. Government policymakers should consider, and firms should be discouraged. So clearly the author has a particular opinion. So that's useful to know. Anyway, let's take a look at the questions. Number 50. The primary purpose of the passage is it A, present the results of statistical analyses and propose further studies? No, there's really no studies in particular. Oh, well, there are analyses that demographic changes in the workforce did not correlate with variations in the total number of temporary workers, but the author certainly isn't saying, hey, let's do more studies. The author is actually recommending action rather than research. B, explain a recent development and predict its eventual consequences. Nope. I mean, if this passage was an article written in 1992, I suppose you could say a surge in temporary employment in the 80s was recent, but that could be up to 10 years ago, so no, not really. C, identify the reasons for a trend and recommend measures to address it. This does capture what we have here. This 1 and 2 in the notes, those are the reasons for a trend, and then recommending measures to address it, that's this. So that sounds pretty good. D, outline several theories about a phenomenon and advocate one of them. Well, we don't really have several theories. We have 2 theories. One is that some people said that temporary workers, more people just wanted temporary work, and then the author's theory is that employers wanted temporary workers. So we're not advocating one theory over another. And then E, describe the potential consequences of implementing a new policy and argue in favor of that policy. No, we don't really talk about the consequences of the policy that the author advocates. So this can't be it. So it is in fact choice C, identify the reasons for a trend and recommend measures to address it. So, number 51. According to the passage, which of the following is true of the factors affecting employers, quote, that are mentioned in lines 10 to 19? So these are the factors here. 10 to 19, that's a lot of lines. I'm not going to go back and reread it, but just we can remember that those were those 2 things. And according to the passage, so this is a detailed question, support for the answer will be in the question, or in the passage. So, what is true of those factors? Is it A, most experts cite them as having initiated the growth in temporary employment that occurred during the 1980s? If anything, this is 180 opposite. The author is saying a lot of observers didn't even take these things into account. They figured, hey, people just wanted temporary jobs. So experts definitely are not citing that. B, they may account for the increase in the total number of temporary workers during the 1980s. That's absolutely the author's stance. The author is saying, hey, this is really what was going on. So we'll keep that one. C, they were less important than demographic change in accounting for the increase of temporary employment during the 1980s. Again, the idea that it was demographic change, that's, again, what other observers who are not the author have been saying, that it's just more people wanted to do it. That's not it. D, they included a sharp increase in the cost of labor during the 1980s. Now, in these factors, we do actually have, where is that? So line 12, one factor is product demand. Temporary employment is favored by employers who are adapting to fluctuating demand for products while at the same time seeking to reduce overall labor costs. We do have a reference to increased labor costs, but nothing that says that they spiked in any way during the 80s. So it's not D. And again, with according to the passage questions, it needs to be in the passage. And then E, these factors, they are more difficult to account for than are other factors involved in the growth of temporary employment during the 1980s. There's nothing that says that these are more difficult to account for. The author seems to do just fine. So that leaves us with answer choice B as the correct one. Oh, I guess we're on the next page. Okay, 381, number 52. The passage suggests which of the following about the use of temporary employment by firms during the 1980s. So the question is asking about firms using temporary employment, which sounds a lot like this section of the passage. So it'll be something like that. Again, without going back and rereading that, that's a big chunk of the passage. It's like half of the passage. So let's just see if anything looks familiar. A, it enabled firms to deal with fluctuating product demand far more efficiently than they did before the 1980s. So this one sounds great at the beginning. It enabled firms to deal with fluctuating product demand. That was that part that I actually just read, getting to the reducing of labor costs in the previous question. And that is actually the one advantage of passages with more questions. Well, there's more than one advantage of passages with more questions, but sometimes reading that you have to do to support your answers in one question may actually overlap with the reading that you need to do for another question. And so it has a kind of a cumulative effect, especially with a shorter passage. Anyway, it's right up until this point where it says it enabled firms to deal with fluctuating product demand far more efficiently than they did before the 1980s. It goes way off the rails. There's nothing in the passage that suggests that this was a huge increase, just that this is something that they started doing. So it's not A. B, did the use of temporary employment by firms during the 1980s increase as a result? This is B. Increase as a result of increased participation in the workforce by certain demographic groups. No, again, increase by certain demographic groups, namely people who want to have temporary jobs, is the position that the author is arguing against. The passage is not suggesting that that's what happened. Was the use of temporary employment by firms during the 80s discouraged by government-mandated policies? No, the author thinks it should be, but it was not. Was it D, a response to preferences indicated by certain employees for more flexible working arrangements? Again, this is something the author wants to happen, not something that did happen in the 80s. And then E, it increased partly as a result of workers' reduced ability to control the terms of their employment. So that may not sound familiar at first, but actually in line 16 really, or 17, labor's reduced bargaining strength, which allows employers more control over the terms of employment. If it allows employers more control over the terms of employment, it allows the workers less control over the terms of their employment. So that's why this was an inference question. It's not something directly stated by the passage, but we can infer it. So it is answer choice E. Okay, on to 53. The passage suggests which of the following about the workers who took temporary jobs during the 1980s. So we had the passage was just, or the question before was about firms hiring temporary employers or employees. Now we want to know about the workers who take these things. And the passage is mostly not about them, but the one thing that we do know from here, make that a different color so it's clear we're on another question, was that it was not necessarily an increase in workers who wanted to do that. That's really all we know from the passage about workers accepting temporary employment during the 80s. So A, does the passage suggest that their jobs frequently led to permanent positions within firms? Nope, nowhere. Does it suggest that they constituted a less demographically diverse group than has been suggested? No. So, it suggests that there were basically two types of workers who typically took temporary work. Those who were new to the workforce, first-time or re-entering workers. Those are the two demographics. So if it were less demographically diverse than normal, it would be only one of those two, when in fact the author is suggesting the reverse, that it was more than just people who wanted temporary work. It was people who maybe didn't want it to but had to for other reasons. So it's not B. Were the workers occasionally involved in actions organized by labor unions? There's really nothing to suggest it, and in fact it's likely that that's not the case, because towards the end of the passage we have this line saying that government policymakers, this is starting at line 24, government policymakers should consider mandating benefit coverage for temporary employees, promoting pay equity between temporary and permanent workers, more importantly here, assisting labor unions in organizing temporary workers, which suggests that they don't actually have labor unions of their own, so those workers were probably not involved in actions organized by labor unions, since the author is suggesting that that's what should happen. So it's not C. D, their pay declined during the decade in comparison with the pay of permanent employees. We have nothing about relative pay. And E, they did not necessarily prefer temporary employment to permanent employment. And that's actually the only thing that we did know about them from the passage, that far from being just the people who wanted to have temporary work, the increased pool of temporary employees included some people who probably weren't there by choice, because the statistical analyses said that there weren't more first-time or re-entering workers in that working pool in the 80s. So answer choice E it is. Some people were in there and didn't want to be. So number 54. The first sentence in the passage suggests that the observers mentioned in line 1 would be most likely to predict which of the following. Let's go back and look and see what those observers are observing. Some observers have attributed the dramatic growth in temporary employment that occurred in the United States during the 1980s to increased participation in the workforce by certain groups, such as first-time or re-entering workers who supposedly prefer such arrangements. So these observers say that the increased temporary employment pool was a larger number of people who wanted that, getting into that. So they would predict something related to that, I suppose. And again, this is an inference, so it's not something actually in there. But let's actually see what the answer choices say. A, would those same observers, predict that the number of new temporary positions would decline as fewer workers who preferred temporary employment entered the workforce? So that actually sounds pretty good. These observers in the passage said temporary employment pool went up because more people who wanted temporary employment got it. They might also predict that if that same temporary employment pool goes down, it was because people who wanted it, the number of people who wanted it went down. So this actually sounds pretty good. Let's take a look at the other ones. Would they predict that the total number of temporary positions would increase as fewer workers were able to find permanent positions? There's nothing in that first sentence about permanent positions. It's all about people wanting temporary labor. C, would they predict that employers would have less control over the terms of workers' employment as workers increased their bargaining strength? That whole, actually, the observers are only, in the observers of the first sentence really are only, the passage only refers to them as caring about workers and their preferences, not employers. It's the author of the passage who does all the stuff with what employers want. So it's not going to be C. D, that more workers would be hired for temporary positions as product demand increased. This one at least focuses on workers, at least indirectly, but again, this is what employers want. This is this variable product demand thing here that the author mentioned, not the observers in the first sentence. And E, that the number of workers taking temporary positions would increase as more workers in any given demographic group entered the workforce. That's contrary to what those observers say. Again, they're saying that it's only the particular first-time or re-entering workers who take temporary positions, and whereas choice E is really what the author, well, it's not really what either the observers or the author are saying, so it's not that. So choice A, that basically the number of new temporary positions and the number of workers who prefer temporary employment, that those are directly correlated. That's what these observers would say. In fact, they would say that they're directly proportional, not just correlated, but proportional. So it's A, check mark. Okay, number 55. In the context of the passage, the word excessive in line 23 most closely corresponds to which of the following phrases? Let's go back and look so that we can recognize the right answer when we see it. Line 23. So this is in the sentence, given the analyses, so if the word that they're mentioning comes in the middle of a sentence, you should at least read the whole sentence. Given the analyses which reveal that growth in temporary employment now far exceeds the level explainable by recent workforce entry rates of groups said to prefer temporary jobs, firms should be discouraged from creating excessive numbers of temporary positions. And of course the word excessive and the word exceeds are related. They share the same root. So the sentence is saying temporary employment exceeds entry into the workforce of the people who want temporary employment, and firms should be discouraged from creating that same exceeding number. Namely, firms should be discouraged from creating numbers of temporary positions that exceed or that far exceed the workforce entry of groups that want those positions. Okay. So A, far more than can be justified by worker preferences. That actually sounds exactly like what that sentence was saying, that because right now temporary positions are far more than people who want it, and firms should be discouraged from doing that amount far more, which is far more than what people want. So A is good. B, far more than can be explained by fluctuations in product demand. Product demand was in the section about factors that led to employers hiring more temporary workers, not in the section where the author is advocating a course of action. It's not that. C, far more than can be beneficial to the success of the firms themselves. We don't actually get into the success of the firms at all, and of course the implication, since firms continued to do it throughout the 80s, is that it can't have been hurting them. So it's not C. Is excessive, far more than can be accounted for by an expanding national economy. National economy is not in the picture, in the passage at all. E, far more than can be attributed to increases in the total number of people in the workforce. It's not that, and in fact we had eliminated demographic changes, including demographic changes in the workforce was eliminated as a cause all the way back in line 7. So that leaves us with A. The excessive was relative to the amount of workers who want those types of jobs. Okay, last one on temporary employment. And last one for the broadcast too, because we won't have time for another passage. Number 56, the passage mentions each of the following as an appropriate kind of governmental action except. So each of the following except questions, of course, are some of the more challenging, because for two reasons. One, you actually have to look at all the answer choices to find the one that's naughty. And then number two, 4 of the 5 answer choices are things that do appear in the passage. Every other question type asks you to find the 1 out of 5 that's something that's right and supported by the passage. All of the following except give you 4 of the things that you've been looking for in every other question and 1 of the things that you've been trying to avoid, and then ask you to switch them. So it's definitely an extra challenge. They give you the slight favor of putting except in capital letters to remind you every time you look at the question, but it's still tricky. Anyway, so 4 of these 5 answer choices will be mentioned as appropriate kinds of governmental action. The good news is the governmental action section is pretty small. It's actually the end of the passage where we're finding out about how the author wants the government to discourage temporary employment. So these should all be within the last, looks like it's about 10 lines. So, hooray, I guess. Let's see which one is not in the passage. A, getting firms to offer temporary employment primarily to a certain group of people. So line 29, encouraging firms to assign temporary jobs primarily to employees who explicitly indicate that preference. That's the certain group that the author wants governmental action on. So yeah, that's in there. That would be appropriate for government to say, only give temporary employment to people who want it. B, encouraging equitable pay for temporary and permanent employees. I had to read that bit, or we had to read that bit for one of the other answer choices, but that was line 26. Starting at line 26, promoting pay equity between temporary and permanent workers. So that's in the passage and therefore is wrong. C, facilitating the organization of temporary workers by labor unions. Again, that's another one that we had to read in a previous question. That was line 28, assisting labor unions in organizing temporary workers. It's not C. D, establishing guidelines on the proportion of temporary workers that firms should employ. Well, I don't remember seeing that, but let's check E. Ensuring that temporary workers obtain benefits from their employers. And that was 25. Policymakers should consider mandating benefit coverage for temporary employees. So that is in the passage and it is wrong. And a quick scan again of that end of the passage tells us, hey, there's nothing in there about proportions of temporary workers. So that is right, that it was answer choice D. That's the one that's not in there. And I'm just going to check the Facebook comments to see if anybody said anything. It's the nice thing about finishing early. I can see if anybody wrote anything. No? Okay, good. You aren't required to comment on Facebook if you're watching, by the way. It's mostly if you have a question about something and I have time, then I'll answer it. Yeah, okay. So this will conclude this broadcast. We're done just like maybe 4 minutes early. So anyway, thanks for joining us again. Next time we will continue with reading comprehension on page 382 with a fairly lengthy passage with a lot of questions. And so we'll see you tomorrow if you're watching this live. If you're watching this recorded, you could watch it tomorrow if you want. You can watch it whenever you want. I realize that the links aren't up yet for people to download, but eventually they will be. And eventually these comments that I make about people in the future being able to watch this in a recorded format will make more sense, I guess, to those people. Whereas the stuff that's directed at the people who live will not make sense to those future people. So those of you listening, you're getting half of those comments are directed at you. Good story. Anyway, my name is Jim Jacobson. This has been the Grockit OGTV GMAT edition. We're going through the 12th edition to the guide, to the test. Putting in a little cloud there for no reason. And we're going through that book cover to cover and answering and going through every question in the book so that you have yet another source for explanations and understanding how to approach these questions. So, thanks for joining us, and see you next time.